Well, I don't know if you remember this, but on April 29th, 2011, the world watched in wonder and awe as England's Prince William, son of the late Princess Diana and the now King of England, King Charles, as he wed Kate Middleton at Westminster Abbey in London. Less than 2 years later, the couple, Kate and William, announced that they were pregnant with their first child. But before this child was born, the British Parliament passed an unprecedented law. It was called the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013. And it declared that the eldest child of the monarchy, regardless of their gender, precedes any of their siblings. So in other words, even if Kate and William's firstborn child was a daughter, she would be the next in line to the royal throne. As an article in The Guardian stated, if it is a girl, the child will make history, becoming the first female firstborn of a future monarch to take precedence over a younger brother. Now, at the time, the Succession to the Crown Act was lauded as being so progressive and so timely, but I can't help but wonder, why did it take them so long? Why did it take them so long to recognize that females should be treated equally under the royal monarchy? Because clearly women were just as capable of ruling as men. The long and successful reign of Queen Elizabeth II was a testament to that. So why was it only in 2013, when Prince William and Princess Kate were pregnant, that this law finally was changed to update this equality? Well, as we often see throughout history, as we saw with the story of Alice Paul, progress and justice, it takes time. Changes aren't made overnight. Equality is a constant battle, and we must be willing to fight for change as we advocate for ourselves and especially for others. Well, this is the lesson we can learn today from the bold and untold story of the daughters of Zelophehad, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Now, I have to confess, even though I've grown up in the church, I went to Sunday school and children's church every single week, I have 3 degrees in ministry and religion, I had never heard of today's story until I read about it in a book last year. The book was called The Widening of God's Mercy. It's by a father and son pair. They're both theologians and biblical scholars, Richard Hayes, who's now since passed, and his son Christopher Hayes. And this is probably one of the best books that I read in 2025, and I'll talk a little bit more about what they wrote later. But I'm guessing that I'm probably not the only one who was unfamiliar with this story in Numbers until Joyce read it earlier. How many have ever heard a sermon on the 5 daughters of Zelophehad before? Anybody? How many of these 5 ladies are your favorite biblical characters? They're your heroes. They're your favorite story in the Bible. And this passage in Numbers 27, it's not found in the Revised Common Lectionary. That's the 3-year cycle of readings and preaching texts that many churches use, including the United Methodist Church. And the book of Numbers, if you were to sit down and read it cover to cover, it's mostly just a lot of lists. It's lists of names and tribal records and genealogies. It's not one that we regularly study from, either as individuals in our personal devotions or in the church, like in Bible studies. However, I learned this week that the names of Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah are not just named once in the Bible, not just twice, not 3 times, but they are mentioned in 5 different places in the Old Testament. As you can see on the screen, Numbers 26, Numbers 27, Numbers 36, and then later in Joshua and 1 Chronicles. So even though we may not have known their names before today, the daughters of Zelophehad were not lost to time and history. Rather, they are some of the most important women in the entire Bible. And in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, only 2 other people are named in more books than they are, and that is Moses and Miriam. So although we may not have known their names before today, they are significant. especially since women often went unnamed in the Bible. In fact, here's a few more numbers for you. Of the about 1,426 names, about the 1,400 names that are given in the Old Testament for people, about 1,300 of them are male, 1,315. And so the ones that are left, only 111 of them are female, and 5 of them are these daughters of Zelophehad. So clearly, their story has something important to tell us. Their actions can point us to the heart of God and the character of who God is. Well, how did these 5 women end up in their position anyways? How did they end up standing before Moses in the tent of meeting? Well, the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, it begins much earlier. Last week we talked about the Hebrew midwives and how the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. Well, this takes place well after that. The Israelites had been delivered from slavery in Egypt. They had crossed the Red Sea. God had given them the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, and they had spent about 40 years wandering around in the desert wilderness. And now finally, they are preparing to enter the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised them. And so Moses and the other leaders, they were divvying up the land to the tribes of Israel. They were making sure that everyone had a fair and equal share. But it turns out that people preparing to live together, they need a lot of rules. The Israelites needed more guidance from God than just the 10 Commandments as they prepared to move into the promised land, as they prepared to live together peacefully. And so these rules are found in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy as the people wrestled with the practical implications of living together as God's chosen people. So one of those rules was that if a man died, his property, his possessions, his inheritance, it would be passed on to his sons. Seems pretty straightforward. But what if a man didn't have any sons? What would happen to his property then? Would it be given to his brothers, to his nephews, or to his daughters, if he had any daughters? What happens when the old rules and the old laws are not enough to address the current needs of the people? Well, that is the situation that Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah found themselves in Numbers 27. So picture the scene with me, if you will. These 5 sisters, they were completely vulnerable. They were completely powerless. Their father had died. They had no brothers. They had no husbands, and so they had no sons. And so in that society, they had no protection. They had no one to speak on their behalf. And then they stood up in front of Moses, the high priest, in front of all the people. The tent of meeting was this very public place. It was a very public scene. And they entered into this place that was ruled by powerful men and where women's voices were often not heard or considered. And they put their fate in the hands of others. Yet they stood together as sisters. They had each other's backs. They were fighting not only for their father's legacy, but for their own inheritance. And they were not only advocating for themselves, but for every woman who would come after them, who would find themselves in a similar position. So you think of what the people around them might have thought or might have said to each other. Some may have said, oh, they are so brave. They are so bold. Look at what confidence they have. But of course, others may have looked at them and said, oh, they are so foolhardy. These uppity women, who do they think they are? Making demands of Moses, making demands of God. Because here's the thing, their claim wasn't just that Moses should give them land. They were asserting that God had gotten something wrong, that the earlier rule, the earlier law that God had put in place was unfair, inadequate, and insufficient. They were challenging a direct decree of God's word. Yet they were united with one voice and one purpose, and so the sisters declared, give to us a possession. Give us our inheritance. Give us what is due. You could almost feel the tension in the room. the drama, the suspense, what was going to happen? How was Moses going to respond? Was Moses going to dismiss them and send them away? Yet to Moses' credit, he doesn't say anything at all. Instead, he takes their response directly to God. And God responded emphatically in their favor. God said, they are right. The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance. So what relief they must have felt, what joy and happiness they were experiencing. But God didn't stop there, because God continued talking. And God goes on to revise the earlier law that had been set in place. God changed God's own rules and went on to declare, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. And went on to say, this shall be for the Israelites a statute and an ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. So the bravery and the boldness of Mala, of Noah, of Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, it changed the law for every Israelite woman who would come after them forever. So justice was won. Equality was achieved. The law was changed. Everything was right in the world. End of story, right? Well, we'll get back to the daughters of Zelophehad here in a few minutes. But first, what does this rather unusual story have to tell us today? What does this story have to tell us about who God is and about God's character? Well, as Richard and Christopher Hayes write in their book, the first thing this story tells us is that God can be challenged. This is what they write. A God who cannot be challenged is too small to be the God described in the Bible. Humans, however, really like to put God in a box. So no matter what is on our heart, what is on our mind, God can handle it. God is big enough to handle our questions, our challenges, even our accusations. God can take it when we bring our anger, our grief, our frustration, when we say, God, why did you let this happen? God, where are you when I'm hurting? God, this doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem fair. Why aren't you doing anything about it? God, I think that maybe you got this one wrong. We can bring all of that to God, any emotion, anything we're feeling, and God won't turn us away. We read a part of it earlier in our call to worship, but just look at what the psalmist says in Psalm chapter 7. Get up, Lord. Get angry. Stand up against the fury of my foes. Wake up, my God. Command that justice be done. So God can take our confrontations, especially when we are standing up on behalf of justice, when we are standing up for others. God can handle being challenged. God doesn't need us as defenders. And for that matter, the Bible can also handle being challenged and questioned, especially when the Bible has been used to hurt or to harm or oppress other people. Well, what else can we learn from this story? Second, the daughters of Zelophehad show us that God responds to the agency of humans and that God even changes the rules. Now, we often think of God as this sort of immutable, static, unchanging, forever the same being. But that's not always the case. And that's certainly not the picture of God we read about in the Bible. In one of my favorite stories in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham is attempting to convince God not to destroy the city of Sodom. So Abraham says to God, God, what if you can find 50 righteous people in the city? Will you still destroy it if there's 50 righteous people? And God says, well, no, I guess not. I won't destroy it if there's 50 righteous people. And Abraham comes back and says, well, what about 45? What about 40? What about 30? What about 25? And finally, Abraham talks God down to 10 people, not destroying the city if there were 10 righteous people to be found in it. So God responded to Abraham's agency and advocacy. God changed God's mind. And that's not the only time in Scripture where something like this happens. Like I mentioned earlier, throughout the Old Testament, you have so many laws and statutes and ordinance, but there's many places where those laws were changed to reflect the needs of the people. So you'll find a verse in one part of the Bible, say in Leviticus, that says one thing, but then just a couple of books later in Deuteronomy, you'll find a law on a similar topic or the same topic, and it says something totally different. So God was revising the rules and the laws that God had put in place earlier. These laws were living and breathing and adaptable. And as we saw in Numbers 27, God actively reinterpreted and revised the existing laws and practices that had been set in place. Now later, God came to earth as a human, as Jesus. And Jesus was someone who frequently challenged the rules and responded to humans' agencies. So, often when Jesus was preaching, we see this a lot in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would say something like, well, you have heard it said, but I say to you. So he took the laws and he kind of reinterpreted them. He revised them. In another story of Jesus, a Canaanite woman, a foreigner woman, came up to Jesus and begged for him to heal her daughter. And at first, Jesus just kind of ignores her. The disciples try to send her away, but she persists. And when she persisted, he finally said to her, I have only come to the lost sheep of Israel. In other words, it's not my job to help you. I'm not here for you. But the Canaanite woman didn't give up. She continued to press Jesus, and eventually Jesus relented and healed her daughter. Jesus, God in the flesh, changed his mind and responded to the agency of that Canaanite mother. So these stories, they invite us to come forward, to stand up, to speak out, to question, and to demand that change happens when we are the ones experiencing injustice. And these stories also show us that God will respond to our pleas for justice, just as God did for Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Well, finally, this story tells us that God's character is one marked by faithfulness and mercy. Christopher and Richard Hayes put it this way in their book: the ability to hear the cries of the oppressed is a quintessential attribute of the God of Israel. In other words, God cares for us. God hears our cries. God hears our prayers. God is on the side of the weak and the vulnerable, the oppressed and abused. And more than anything else, God is love. God is compassionate. God is faithful. God is merciful. That's who our God is. So this story in Numbers 27, it is a portrait of God's goodness and God's faithfulness. God listened to the needs of these women. God cared for them, and God responded to them. God is just, and God is even open to changing the rules. As Christopher and Richard Hayes write in their book, God is constantly widening the circle of mercy and inclusion to bring others in to God's family. Now, I wish that I could end my sermon right there on such a positive note, but unfortunately, the story of Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, it didn't end in Numbers chapter 27, and they didn't get their happy ending, at least not right away. So years passed, Moses dies, a new leader takes his place, Joshua. The Israelite people finally move into the land of Canaan as they conquered it, as they settled it. The Israelites are finally receiving their inheritance that they were promised. But what happened to the daughters of Zelophehad? Did they get their inheritance? Did they get their land too? Nope. Because long after Moses was dead, they had to bring their case to the leaders again, this time to Joshua. But unlike Moses, Joshua granted their request immediately. It took years and years before justice was finally granted to Mala, to Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. But justice came eventually. And that's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come right away. Sometimes it takes years and years and years. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Change takes a long time, but it does happen eventually. And often, justice only comes about through many people working together. The daughters of Zelophehad, they couldn't receive their father's land or inheritance all on their own. They first had to approach Moses and the high priest, and then later they had to go before Joshua in order for their story to be complete, in order for justice to be done for them. These women needed the assistance and the advocacy of others who were also fighting on their behalf. They needed the men in power to listen to them, to grant them the help they deserved. And in the same way, justice today will only come about when all of us are working together to achieve it. Now, I want to close with the story of some modern day saints. That's one of the things we're doing in this series. We're not only looking at these bold and untold stories in Scripture, but also those around the world today that are continuing to fight for justice. And this story today comes from the women of the Jerusalem Princess Basma Center in West Bank. I first read about this story in a UMC article or newsletter that was sent out to me. And so when children in the West Bank of Palestine have developmental delays or they have a long-term disability, as you can expect, there's not a whole lot of places they can turn to for help. However, the Child Rehabilitation Center at the Jerusalem Princess Basma Center has an outreach program just for them. Their services include physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and speech and language therapy for these children that often have no other options. But not only that, the center empowers their mothers by providing support and guidance and training and education and encouragement. So they're creating this center where no one feels alone, especially not families with special needs children who often feel like they are trying to do this all by themselves. So despite being crippled by 2 wars, first the war in Gaza and now the war in Iran, the center continues to operate, continues to reach out to these children in need, and they often do so through grants and donations, including the United Methodist Church's Peace and Justice Fund. So when we all wonder what our UMC apportionments are going to, some of it, a portion of it at least, goes to projects like this one. But none of this would happen without the advocacy and the support of these women. Brave and bold women who live in the spirit of the daughters of Zelophehad. Women who are standing up for the needs of their children. In the article, there's one mother who shared that she has had to learn how to advocate for herself and for her child. And so when she meets other parents in the same position who have disabled children, she encourages them, and this is what she said: "The journey is never easy at the beginning, but do not give up. Persistence will lead you to your goal." The journey towards justice and equality is never easy, and it is rarely completed in one day. But do not give up. Persist like Mala, like Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Persist like that Canaanite woman. Advocate, raise your voice, stand up, and demand justice, because we know that our God will respond.